You unlock this door with the key of compassion. Beyond it is another world, a world of science, a world of common sense, a world of sanity. You're moving into a land of both empathy and ethics, of nutritional knowledge and empowerment. You've just crossed over into Dr. Osborne's zone. Hi, this is Dr. Peter Osborne with Gluten Free Society, and today I have a very special guest on the phone with me, Dr. Stephanie Seneff of MIT. Dr. Seneff, thank you so much for being present today and taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us.
My pleasure. I'm delighted to be here.
Would you introduce yourself and just tell everybody what your background is and what your education is?
Okay. Yes, I'm at MIT. I've been here all my adult life. I went here as an undergraduate, majored in biology with a minor in food and nutrition. My Ph.D. is in computer science. And I've spent many years working in computer science and natural language and understanding processing, many papers published and whatnot. Over the past 7 years, I've been transitioning more to the biology side again, returning to the past in a sense, and gotten really passionately interested in trying to understand what's causing all the problems that we're seeing today in our health. I'm convinced that, there's major environmental toxins that are making us sick, and I need to identify which ones they are. So I've been systematically studying that for the last 7 years and really gained a lot of insight and understanding about what's happening. And now the question is how to fix it, I think. So I've published several papers in the last few years in biology and medicine with co-authors, collaborating with a number of people in this space of the role of environmental toxins in modern diseases.
And your recent paper, Interdisciplinary Toxicology, I think co-authored with Anthony Samsel, was what actually turned me on to some of your work and theories around Roundup, the chemical that is prominently being used on many of our crops. Can you talk a little bit about Roundup and talk about its use and how that's increased? And let's just go into how some of those or some of its use has how you found the correlation between that and the increased incidence of gluten reactivity.
Yes, it's quite amazing. I mean, when you start looking, you see that among all the chemicals that are used in growing our crops today, Roundup stands out as one whose usage rates have gone up alarmingly in the last 10 years, directly in step with the alarming increase in a number of diseases, one of which is celiac disease, which seems to have just appeared out of nowhere. I mean, I don't remember even knowing the word a few years back, and now you've got the gluten-free section in every grocery store in the country, basically. It's just really come out of nowhere. And the interesting thing is that wheat, of course, wheat has been changed through the years. They've done a lot of genetic modifications of the wheat. It's not the same as the heritage wheat was in the past, but I don't think that's the key problem. The problem, I think, is that the glyphosate in Roundup, the glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, is being sprayed on the wheat increasingly right before the harvest. Just a few days before the harvest, they spray the wheat with Roundup intentionally in order to kill it. So wheat is not Roundup ready. There's many crops that are GMO modified to be Roundup ready, meaning that they don't die if they're exposed to this toxic chemical. Almost all plants die. I mean, glyphosate is a universal herbicide, which is part of why the people find it attractive. And it's considered to be non-toxic, so farmers think it's a good choice. Unfortunately, that is wrong. That is an incorrect assumption from what I've seen. I mean, the research that's been done already, there's a lot of papers, and we've referenced a lot of papers in our paper, show that glyphosate is simply, that the idea that glyphosate is non-toxic is not true. So we think the wheat gluten actually binds to the glyphosate, and that disrupts a process that usually happens in the digestive system that would make it into a non-toxic form. That chemical process gets disrupted by the glyphosate, and then the gluten becomes something that the body becomes allergic to, and that is what causes the cascade that leads to celiac disease.
So what you're saying then, I want to put it in very layman's terms for some of our listeners, is that the glyphosate being sprayed on the wheat binds to the wheat and basically increases its toxicity or makes it more toxic, or are you saying that the wheat
makes
itself
it allergenic?
Okay, just basically makes it more allergenic.
Yes.
And I've read some papers, and some of the things you've mentioned in your research are the effect on transglutaminase, and I've read some papers on adding microbial transglutaminase to dairy products and how that increases the allergenicity of dairy because it unfolds proteins in the dairy that actually look very similar to gluten and therefore increase that reaction.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that, actually. That's something new to me. But I can comment on another.
Yeah.
Yes, I would love to see that. Another interesting thing that glyphosate that directly connects to glyphosate. Glyphosate is a bacterial. It kills bacteria, and it preferentially kills the good bacteria in your gut. One of those is bifidobacteria, and those guys are really important for processing the wheat, the gluten. So when they aren't they're destroyed by glyphosate, then the wheat again suffers not being fully digested properly, such that it remains in these allergenic forms in your gut and causes this reaction. So the fact that glyphosate kills these bacteria is another feature that's going to lead to celiac disease.
So we have a function on basically on the normal microbiome within the gut wall that has an antibiotic-based effect on preferential bacteria that aid in the digestion of difficult-to-digest proteins. And have you seen the new research that's come out on sourdough bread, adding lactobacillus, high levels of lactobacillus?
Yes, that's another one, the lactobacillus, which is also preferentially killed by glyphosate. So glyphosate kills the ones that you need to be able to properly process these foods.
So we have an effect on gut bacteria. Then we have the fact that it makes food that is sprayed with the chemical more allergenic. In essence, people react or respond even more aggressively to them than what they otherwise would. What are some of the other effects that glyphosate has on the human body or on the plant that affects the human as they eat it?
Right, that's right, because the plant, of course, so what the argument is, glyphosate disrupts this critical pathway in plants called the shikimate pathway, and that pathway produces 3 essential amino acids, which are called aromatic amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. And it turns out these 3 amino acids are really important to our health, and we depend on our food and our bacteria to produce them for us. So the food that is exposed to glyphosate is depleted in these nutrients, and the gut bacteria can't produce them in the context of glyphosate. So we end up deficient in these nutrients, and one of the big ones is tryptophan. Tryptophan is the sole precursor to serotonin, and serotonin deficiency is a huge problem in the modern world. It's linked to depression, violent behavior, obesity, and celiac disease. So I think serotonin deficiency is a critical piece of the puzzle as well.
No doubt, and you said tyrosine as well?
Yes,
And so we have tryptophan and tyrosine, so serotonin as well as tyrosine being a precursor for thyroid hormone. And I know that in my clinic, that is one of the most prolific problems that patients will come in, and they will have hypothyroidism, or they'll have developed Hashimoto's disease as a result. So, you know, what you're saying about glyphosate is that it can cause deficiency in the actual amino acids in the food that we eat, because the plants need to be able to synthesize those foods to survive, and glyphosate inhibits that process. But what you're also saying is that glyphosate destroys and damages our gut flora, which help us to digest the food and produce these amino acids. So there's 2 mechanisms of action here that are causing that deficiency.
You got it. You're good. Great summary.
So big problems, right? And I know one of the things in our clinic that we use or that we measure, oftentimes we'll measure serotonin, and oftentimes we'll also try to measure thyroid hormone. And this is very prolific. We'll see these numbers coming back. And I know if we look at even the top 5 drugs in the United States, one of the top in that is antidepressants. Right. Now let's comment too on. Let me hear your thoughts on serotonin's impact on gut motility, because it isn't. You know, we have a gut nervous system.
That's right.
And its primary neurotransmitter is serotonin. Can you comment a little bit more on that?
Well, yes, actually, what I think happens, and this is speculation. We didn't find papers that said this, but we could see the evidence from the details in the research that the serotonin receptors producers in association with celiac disease are very aggressive to make serotonin whenever they have a chance. So I think it's because the tryptophan deficiency. As soon as you eat some food that has tryptophan in it, these your cells in your gut that make serotonin grab the opportunity to make it, and they make too much, and then you get things like nausea and diarrhea because it gives you the gut mobility. It overdoes it, but it's because your body is so desperate for serotonin that the moment it gets an opportunity, it has to overdo it to take advantage of that opportunity because it's so scarce and it needs it so badly. So I think there's sort of a swinging back and forth between too little and too much to ends up with diarrhea and constipation, depending upon the diet, because you just aren't getting a steady supply.
Yeah, great point. So we get a kind of a transient up and down effect based on what the diet is giving, because the gut is in a state of deficit. Oversensitivity because of the deficit. Right. And so then it needs to be able to produce, so when it gets the opportunity, it makes an abundance.
Yeah, too much, yeah.
Tell me a little bit. One of the things I read about in your paper was the cytochrome P450, which is the enzymatic systems within the liver that help the body detoxify. Can you tell us the effect that glyphosate has on those particular systems?
Yeah, I mean, that is a huge piece of the puzzle, and we were really astonished as we looked at how many different aspects of celiac disease is a very complex disease with a lot of interesting comorbidities, and what's amazing is that so many of them can be explained simply by the cytochrome P450 enzymes, which you can call CYP enzymes for short, CYP. They're amazing. I mean, there are so many of them in the liver, and they do so many different things. And all of the things that they do are disrupted in celiac disease. So it's really perfect. And glyphosate disrupts those enzymes. That's been shown in rat liver. So, in the liver of a mammal, glyphosate interferes with the cytochrome P450 enzymes. So, for example, a simple example is that they activate vitamin D. And when you measure vitamin D in the blood, you're measuring the form that's been activated by the liver using a CYP enzyme. And I'm sure that you've been hearing, all of a sudden we have a massive vitamin D deficiency problem in this country. So the solution is just to pump everybody full of vitamin D supplements. But the problem is due to, I believe, the fact that glyphosate is preventing the vitamin D from getting activated. It's that simple, which is why it's low. And it's low in association with celiac disease.
Okay. So it actually inhibits the activation of vitamin D metabolites that actually go about to bring about the hormonal functions for vitamin D.
Exactly. Yeah, it won't work if it's not activated. And so, on the other hand, the CYP enzymes break down retinoic acid in the liver. Now, retinoic acid is actually something that can cause troubles, both in terms of introducing this new condition called eosinophilic esophagitis, which is like an inflamed esophagus, and people have trouble swallowing. It's a new disease, first identified in the 1990s. I think it's a direct consequence of glyphosate. And retinoic acid, excess retinoic acid plays a role in that. It also plays a role in infertility and in birth defects. And celiac people have an increased risk of infertility and of producing offspring with birth defects, which I think is, again, due to the fact that there's too much retinoic acid because it can't be broken down by the CYP enzymes in the liver. And the other thing is bile acids. So we basically end up with vitamin A toxicity. Right. Okay. So you have vitamin A toxicity and vitamin D deficiency, and then you have the bile acids, which are, there's several CYP enzymes involved in producing the bile acids in the liver, which are then sent by the bile duct into the gut to deal with digesting fats. So I think a lot of people are going to have trouble digesting fats because they're not producing the bile acids because of the CYP enzyme problem in the liver, and that's also associated with celiac disease. So just one more effect. So I'm gonna just repeat that, make sure I hear you correctly. The abnormal function of these liver enzymes responsible for detoxification, as well as metabolism, as well as production of bile, are hindered. And so what you just said was that bile inhibition leads to fat absorption problems, and so our fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A and D and E and K, as well as omega-3 fatty acids and other fats, are now at risk for becoming deficient. That's right.
Okay.
And of course, also messing up the digestive system because the fats don't get digested.
Right, and so now you have a higher acidic component, fatty acid component in the gut, and that's now an increased risk for certain types of cancers.
Right.
So we've got, so far, I mean, we're just talking about one chemical here, and so far we've got glyphosate damaging bacteria. We have glyphosate creating detoxification problems in the liver, creating absorption problems with nutrients. What else do you see in your research? Actually, let me back up. We have it interfering and interrupting with tyrosine and tryptophan metabolism, leading to potentially psychiatric disorders and thyroid problems. One of the things you went into pretty good detail with your paper was the vitamin and mineral deficiencies, and I know we just talked about vitamin D.
That's right.
And we talk about vitamin A toxicity, but let's talk about iron and selenium and some of the other things.
Totally. There's a whole bunch of these minerals that are, especially the rare minerals like cobalamin and molybdenum. These are really, cobalt and molybdenum, which are really critically needed for certain enzymes that do really important things in the body. And you have iron and zinc. I mean, all of these minerals are going to be deficient in the food that's been exposed to glyphosate, as well as in the soil even, and of course in the body as well, and they're going to have trouble absorbing them. So glyphosate chelates these minerals. It forms a cage around them such that the bacteria can't get at them even, and so the gut bacteria become deficient, and then they can't perform, they die because they can't get these critical nutrients. And because glyphosate has caged it. And also the bacteria that are killed are ones that break down phytates, and phytates are also bind these minerals. So because the bacteria are killed that would break it down, the phytates become more abundant, and those also chelate these minerals. So these things are both working against you, that you're going to have deficiencies in iron and zinc and molybdenum and cobalt and all these things, each of which has a huge number of consequences in terms of your health.
Yeah, so like cobalt as an example, in my 13 years of practice, I see more vitamin B12 deficiency than any other nutrient loss, and cobalt
so
is vitamin B12 forming.
Yeah, essential for B12 function, yes. Right.
The other one I see is iron.
Yeah.
Iron deficiency is very common, and the other big one that I see is B vitamins. So B vitamins across the board, which we know are synthesized largely by bacteria in the GI tract. Right.
And then molybdenum is involved in sulfite oxidase, and people end up with sensitivity to sulfites because they can't oxidize the sulfite to sulfate, which would make it safe. Sulfite's very reactive, and you need that in the gut, the molybdenum, to be able to detoxify the sulfites, for example, in wine.
So sulfites, and then other foods that have added sulfites.
Yes, right. It's for preservative. Yeah.
And so I want to back up just a minute and tie that in, because now I'm thinking, as we talk about sulfites, one of the things I see with sulfite reaction is histamine release from eosinophils. And you just mentioned a moment ago the concept of eosinophilia or esophagitis, right? And so is that a corollary then that we're making? Is that this process leads to the inability to process sulfites, which leads to mast cell mobilization, histamine release, and subsequent inflammatory damage?
You know a lot. That's beautifully said. I couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah, so you get an inflamed esophagus. I mean, that's a big thing in infants, too. We see a lot of infants that are getting kind of an acid reflux. It's not the normal acid reflux. It's due to this other problem, which is a new problem today because of this. And part of that is the insufficient supply of sulfate. If you can't oxidize the sulfite, you can't make the sulfate, right?
Right.
So you end up with a sulfate deficiency, and that, I think, is behind, as I on my webpage, you'll see that sulfate's my big thing. I mean, I think sulfate deficiency is behind so many problems in modern society. And we have various ways in which it can be caused by glyphosate, and that's just one of them. Many different ways in which glyphosate disrupts sulfate.
I want to get into that, but before we do, I want to bring up another point, because you mentioned infants developing acid reflux, and so what do we see a lot of infants using infant formulas, right? And these are largely corn and soy based.
Yes, that's
coming
very scary.
from GMO, right? Coming from
Right.
GMO crops with lots of Roundup in them.
It terrifies me.
Yeah, we didn't have these problems before, and I even see the same thing happening now in elderly because they're being told to drink drinks like Ensure.
Right.
Which are basically just adult versions of baby formula.
Oh, gosh, that's just really scary. No, the soy, I don't eat soy unless it's 100% organic. I just won't go near it. And corn, likewise. I won't touch it, They're so contaminated. I mean, both of them are GMO, Roundup ready. 90% of the crop, spray the Roundup on it. It doesn't die. It soaks it up, And there's very little monitoring going on. This is the other thing that's very disturbing. The government thinks it's safe, so we don't look at it,
So it's just an assumption that it's safe, that looking forward that we don't really have anybody aggressively pursuing any kind of investigation as to the increased modern diseases that we're seeing here just since the use was implicated.
Right.
Talk a little bit about sulfites. You mentioned that. You said that glyphosate affects that metabolism pathway. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, there's several ways I think that glyphosate disrupts sulfate. One is serotonin, because actually it's very interesting that serotonin is sulfated in transit. So it's produced in the gut. Most of the serotonin that's made in the body is made in the gut, and then it's shipped to the brain as a sulfated molecule. So it's actually delivering sulfate to the brain. And this is what I believe. And the brain, sulfate deficiency in the brain is a very strong feature of autism. People have looked at the cerebrospinal fluid of autism, postmortem autism patients, and shown that the heparin sulfate in the fluid is depleted. So major problem, I think, with autism is insufficient sulfate in the brain, and part of that is because the serotonin sulfate is not arriving, both because the serotonin is deficient and because the sulfate's deficient. And sulfate, of course, we have the problem with the sulfite oxidase, which would produce sulfate from sulfite. There's other ways to make sulfate. But they're also derailed, too. One of the ones that I've written about in another paper, we have a proposal that a particular enzyme produces sulfate in the skin in exposure to sunlight. And this enzyme is a CYP enzyme. So if glyphosate is getting into the blood, and the red blood cells have this enzyme, and we believe they use it to make sulfate, and then they make cholesterol sulfate. It's well established that the red blood cells produce cholesterol sulfate, which is then distributed to the tissues to provide both cholesterol and sulfate to the tissues. So this CYP enzyme is going to get disrupted by glyphosate, and that's going to reduce the supply of sulfate in that way as well. And then on top of that, we believe that glyphosate competes with sulfate. Free sulfate is very difficult to transport because sulfate tends to turn water into jello. That's a feature of sulfate when it's landed in the position where it's working, but in transport it's very difficult to transport sulfate because it will turn the blood into jello, which would not be good. And glyphosate does the same thing. So we think that glyphosate jams the channel between the gut and the liver such that free sulfate can't go. And we think this is why it's sort of interesting that these bacteria overgrow C. difficile and produces P. cresol. P. cresol can be sulfated. So that becomes a way to deliver sulfate to the liver, packaged up with precresol. Precresol is a toxic chemical. Once it drops off the sulfate, it becomes toxic, so it attacks the liver. But the liver is getting the sulfate that it desperately needs in the process. So your body finds, and the gut bacteria are really collaborating with us to maintain the health of the whole system. It's really a collaborative process, and even the pathogens are doing something essential in the face of this miserable situation. They're delivering the sulfate, but at the same time they're delivering the toxin.
Right. So
and they're doing that for the liver and the kidney.
Right. And so as a delivery mechanism, we're getting it to the liver by demand, but we're dropping off toxins in the liver as a result.
Right, because the things that would not be toxic
literature
are not doing it, because the serotonin's not doing it, the dopamine's not doing it, the cholesterol's not doing it. So all the normal processes that we have in place to deliver sulfate are broken. Therefore, you have to kind of come up with these other methods that are really dangerous. The product, once the sulfate is dropped off, you've got the toxic chemical to deal with.
And would you, or have you come across any research on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and glyphosate exposure?
I should do that research because I'm sure it's connected, but I haven't done that explicitly, so I don't know if there's papers on that.
I've seen it clinically and could probably write a few, but I have actually seen a number of patients who, were accused of being alcoholics, right, by their primary care, even though they didn't drink at all. And when we get them off of, in my clinic, we get them off of grain, which is a large part of where the glyphosate is being delivered. So I'm just curious if you'd come across anything in the literature.
It's on my list of things that I'd like to write about. I've been studying that. I mean, I've been looking into that. I've got so many things I'm looking into, and we try to figure out what's the next most, something crystallizes. Anthony and I are just doing all this reading and all this studying, and then something will crystallize into a story, and we'll put it together in a paper, and we'll do that again. I mean, we've got several topics right now we're playing with, but we haven't figured out yet which one's going to be the next one out the door, But the fatty liver is definitely there. And that's, of course, I think that's because the liver can't, the liver is processing sugar, actually, fructose, and turning it into fat. And it's unable to get rid of, to ship out the cholesterol through the bile acids because of the disabled type enzymes, So the cholesterol piles up, and you have to store cholesterol with fat. You can't just store cholesterol unless you have a proportional amount of fat. And so in some sense, I think the liver is just overloaded with cholesterol because it can't get rid of it through the bile acids. That's also why the LDL would go up, so it would ship it out as LDL, or it could just store it locally. And it also might choose to store the cholesterol because it's waiting for an opportunity to get sulfate so that it can make cholesterol sulfate. Sulfate is the deficiency that's holding the cholesterol back. So the fatty deposits are there to store cholesterol temporarily until there's an opportunity to release it, either in an LDL particle or through the bile acids as cholesterol sulfate. So the bile acids, a lot of the cholesterol sulfate goes into the bile acids, which it can't make because of the CYP enzyme problem. So that's another way that
it's just a vicious cycle, basically.
It's just a mess. You look every which way, it's just a mess what goes on.
Let's talk. We've talked a lot about the damaging effect of this chemical. Can you kind of share with our audience, where is there risk of exposure? We know grain, but can we go through some of the different foods and things that a person would absolutely want to avoid?
Yes, well, at the top of the list is going to be all of the GMO Roundup Ready crops, and those are the core crops of the processed food industry. So you've got the corn, the soy, the canola, which is the canola oil, one of the cheap oils that's used very frequently in processed foods, sugar beets, alfalfa. So there's actually just a small list of crops that are grown in huge amounts, and that 90% of them are GMO Roundup Ready. So those are going to be really bad. Basically, don't eat them. And that pretty much means don't eat processed foods because you kind of can't avoid them. You're going to have the high fructose corn syrup is going to be corn. Sugar beets is going to be sugar. And if you're going to go sugar cane, sugar cane is not Roundup Ready, but it's sprayed with glyphosate right before the harvest, just like wheat. In fact, sugarcane agricultural workers are coming up with kidney failure in alarming rates in countries where the sugarcane is grown, in Sri Lanka and in India and in Central America. And actually, 2 countries have been proactive to ban glyphosate, Sri Lanka and El Salvador. Really thrilled about this. In the past year, in fact, El Salvador just a month ago, the governments have banned glyphosate usage on their crops. I think that's a great move, and we need to have all the countries do that. They're going to, I think one by one they will. It'll eventually be like DDT, taken off the market, but I don't know how long it's going to take.
Well, you're battling a pretty powerful and pretty wealthy corporate.
I know, and they fight hard too. They fight dirty, so it's going to be quite a battle, I think.
Now, you listed a table in your paper on the different commodities in the parts per million of glyphosate found. Now, I'm gonna assume it's a pretty comprehensive list, and I'm gonna put a picture of that list.
Okay, good.
Up for my listeners, if that's okay, if I can use that.
That would be great. Yes.
One of the things, or several of the things that as I went through your list, and I don't know if you've heard of this, so I want to share it because our listeners have heard of it, and I want to kind of make a correlation here. There is a concept going around right now in the gluten-free world called cross-reactivity, which is when you have an antigen that is similar in structure. so that when it binds to a receptor like an HLA-DQ receptor, if it's similar enough in structure to the gluten proteins that we've identified for celiac disease, that it can create a Th1 or Th2 inflammatory immune response. And many of the things that you've listed as being higher content glyphosate are the foods that they're finding have greater degree of cross-reactivity.
That's very interesting.
That's something that, to me, is just kind of light bulb just turned on in my head.
Right. I wouldn't have recognized that, but that's extremely interesting. I have suspected, by the way, that even cigarettes and alcohol toxicity, I don't know to what extent their toxicity is directly tied to the toxic poisons that are in them. If you think about smoking, so tobacco is one of the crops that's Roundup ready. So they're going to spray glyphosate on the tobacco, and then you're going to smoke it. So if you're getting glyphosate in your lungs, that's going to be very toxic, you know. And so you wonder if you were smoking organic tobacco, it might not be so bad for you, you know. Right.
Well, I've thought that often because we have a history of Native Americans with long histories of smoking, but very little evidence of lung cancer.
Interesting.
So is it actually the tobacco, or is it what we're doing to it?
They might be growing tobacco with its organic. That's very interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah, and alcohol too, right? So alcohol, of course, is a grain, barley. And I think the UK is really suffering right now with a lot of obesity and heart disease. They're struggling to figure out, the United Kingdom, to figure out what's going on. I am guessing that they're spraying, I know the UK is spraying Roundup much more right before the harvest than they used to just a few years ago. So they've been increasing that practice in the UK of spraying these crops with Roundup right before the harvest. And barley is one of those crops, and barley is beer. So beer is very popular in the UK. So I am guessing that a reason why they're having so many health problems there recently is because they're drinking beer that's got too much glyphosate in it.
Now, on that same note, many in the United States, many of the food manufacturers for the celiac disease and gluten-sensitive population are producing substitutes, and largely, you know, as we all know, they're corn-based, rice-based. Sorghum is becoming like the new super grain. But sorghum is one of those also on the list that's high in glyphosate.
Interesting.
Do you have any evidence or research that shows, because we talked at the very beginning of our conversation, we said that the government considers glyphosate safe.
Right.
But is there anything that we have, animal or human studies, that show a part per million dose where we start really seeing problems and damage showing up?
Well, there's the Serotonin study. Are you familiar with the Serotonin study?
No, I'm not.
So he's in France, and they did a very interesting study on rats, and they fed them GMO foods with and without glyphosate. So they had 4 different groups of rats with BT corn as well. So there was the BT, there was the Roundup Ready GMO, and then there was the Roundup Ready GMO with the Roundup itself. So there were different conditions, and compared them to rats that were fed an organic diet of the same foods. And these rats, they fed them these diets throughout their lifespan from birth, and what they found was that they didn't see any problems at all until 4 months. So for the first 3 months, things were fine. The problems started to show up at 4 months. By the end of their life, they had huge mammary tumors and liver toxicity, kidney toxicity, early death. Lots of problems. And this paper was written up and published, and then, I don't know, maybe a year or two later, it was forced to be retracted, which happened on Thanksgiving Day this past Thanksgiving Day, it was retracted. So the journal put pressures on them, probably because of pressures from the industry. You can't prove that, to retract this paper. And the journal even admits that the retraction is not based on any grounds. There aren't any legal grounds for the retraction, given what's required for a retraction, things like cheating, which simply were not happening. The claim was that there were not enough rats for statistical significance. And the fact is that they didn't have any fewer rats than there were in all the studies that had been done by the industry, but had only gone for 3 months. So basically the same kinds of experiments had been done by the industry over a 3-month period to show no harm. And the fact is that they didn't have any fewer rats than there were in all the studies that had been done by the industry, but had only gone for 3 months. So basically the same kinds of experiments had been done by the industry over a 3-month period to show no harm. you have to wait 4 months to see the problem. That's the thing, is that it's a slow, insidious toxicity that you don't immediately see. So as long as you cut the experiment off after 3 months, then everybody's happy. You can go home and go ahead and eat your glyphosate and poison yourself and not know better because you think it's fine. You have to go through these longer studies in order to see the damage. But then they managed to get this paper retracted, so now it can't be used as evidence to try to convince the government to worry about glyphosate.
Yeah, that sounds like politics to me.
No, I know. Well, it's amazing how much power there is in money, and this is what we're up against. I mean, people would rather have people suffer from all these problems than to not make that money, apparently, which I find shocking. But
well, and then any time I deal with patients, many of them are very hesitant to want to change their diets. Right? They're used to a particular way. Food is such a social addiction. And so you're not just battling, take this food out of your diet. You're battling years of marketing. You're battling years of people having, traditions that they've created with these different types of foods. I think ultimately. And
also you're battling the fact that when you eat those potato chips, you don't feel anything. So you don't have this direct sense of, oh my God, this is killing me, because it's an insidious process that happens slowly over time. So no particular piece of food you eat, you can't connect the dots unless you just do it rationally and you see the long-term evidence from the literature and you finally are convinced,
Right.
So, I mean, my husband and I now, we just buy everything organic. And luckily we live near a Whole Foods and it's a wonderful store. We just, we won't make it if it's not organic, And it's been
so that's the
neat that
takeaway
Whole Foods
for people.
has so many choices.
The takeaway is grow your own food in your own soil without the use of pesticide, or to buy it organically. What do you think about? I know one of the things that we see in the grocery stores, and Whole Foods does this, is the importation of a lot from South America.
Yeah.
What do you feel about that? My concern with a lot of that is how much control do we really have? Our EPA doesn't have a control over that. And we know that they use, for many of the crops that we do import, that glyphosate is used in great quantities.
What are you saying? You're saying if it's an organic product from South America, do we trust it? Is that what you're asking?
One, do we trust it? Or two, is it as organic as it would be if it were grown in the U.S.? Is it grown right next door to a potential glyphosate field or infected
that's
field?
That's probably happening in the U.S. as well, right? I mean, pretty much here. U.S. buys 25% of the world's glyphosate, so this is probably almost the worst place to grow an organic crop, to try to keep yourself from... Because there's going to be glyphosate in the soil. The stuff doesn't break down. I mean, they claim it breaks down quickly, but I have seen studies in certain soils, like with high humus and with high acidity, that can last for 20 years.
20 years.
Yeah.
What do we do if it's in water runoff now?
I know, that's another problem.
Have you come across research
in the water,
that shows
in the air
what kind of filters will remove it? Are we talking about potentially granular activated carbon, maybe zeolite? I mean, have you read anything about that?
I don't know. And, of course, no one's trying because it's harmless. I mean, this is the really insidious thing about it, is that no one thinks it's a problem, and they don't even measure it. There was a paper that just came out looking at glyphosate in rain in, I think, Mississippi, and it was like 86% of the time they found it in the rain in the study that they did. And it was in an area near crops that were being, sprayed with it. But, I mean, it's very hard to avoid. Even if you're going organic, you drink a glass of water, you don't know how much is in there, right?
Right.
It's kind of scary. I mean, to think that it's all over the place, it really kind of makes my skin crawl to think of these people making more and more of this chemical and pouring it out into the world, It just become harder and harder to try to figure out how to keep from getting yourself exposed to it, You have to go move to another planet to get away from it, it seems like.
We need a new spaceship and a community to go, right?
Yeah.
So let's just kind of summarize then. So here we have this ubiquitous environmental chemical. 25% of its use is right here in the United States. It's used on a number of different foods, whether in Roundup Ready seeds or as a weed killer to soak with, or to allow for crops to, before we harvest them, to kill the weeds before we go in and make a harvest. It interferes with liver enzymes that aid in detoxification. Primarily sulfites and fates are affected, which can contribute to or can cause similar symptoms that we see with hyperallergic or allergenicity, as well as autism and other conditions. It can affect the gut bacteria, affecting our synthesis of vitamins and our ability to digest our food, making our food more allergenic. It can affect the absorption of nutrients through its chelating effect, so it binds to certain minerals that we require as humans to function. It can interfere with metabolism of certain amino acids like serotonin, tryptophan, and phenylalanine, which are important for the function of our thyroid gland, and our gut function, and our brain function. And the only real tool that we have to reduce and minimize our exposure is basically educating consumers and intelligent selection of food and potentially filtration of water. I'm going to look more into this after we are done and find out if we have any evidence or any research on how we could pull this from the water, what kind of filtration devices that we can use. I would assume, or maybe even surmise, that maybe reverse osmosis would probably be the best scientifically to pull this type of chemical out, and maybe carbon wouldn't be sufficient. But so our best was to buy organic and to cook with organic foods and eat organic foods, to not eat out, and whole foods, to not eat out, and to not buy processed foods.
That's right. It's a pretty strict rule, but it's worth it.
Oh, I agree with you. I see it every day. And my journey into this was treating patients who had gluten issues and celiac disease who were not responsive. In other words, they were in that refractory category where they wouldn't get better. And so it started with grain elimination and eliminating other grains. And we would find when we eliminated all the grains, we found a huge improvement in all of these patients who were failing to respond.
Yeah.
So, well, this has been very great. This has been a wonderful conversation.
It has been. I appreciate your knowledge, because you are definitely a quick study and you know a lot already. So very impressive. It's wonderful to talk to someone like that.
Well, thank you, and likewise.
He usually gets it, yes. So it's been great. Thank you so much for doing this.
How can our listeners find you? You mentioned a website. Is there something that you have that
if they type my name, they'll find a bunch of stuff. I've done various videos with Dr. Mercola and with Jeffrey Smith, and radio interviews, and also I have various papers and essays on my website, slides from talks I've given. There's a lot of material. If you just type my name, you can find things. I can give you the web page, but it's a bit messy. PEOPLE people.csail.mit.edu/Seneff SENEFF. And so there I have a bunch of pointers to various papers and essays and slides and stuff like that.
I'll make sure to include that link for everyone listening. Okay. Well, again, Dr. Seneff, thank you so much for taking part in our discussion and bringing to the table so much great and valuable study and research that I think is going to help a lot of change a lot of lives.
I hope so. It's a positive note to know that at least you do have an option. I think that's a wonderful thing, that people can buy organic and that places like Whole Foods do exist. It's a great. We're not completely frustrated that we have to eat the poison. So I think that's a huge benefit. And more people eat organic, then more and more people will produce organic because it will sell. People will be willing to pay the extra price, and the farmers will probably be happy not to have to deal with the chemicals.
Yeah.
So it'll be a win-win situation.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon. And I'm going to be in touch on the back end. There's some things. I'll send you that paper on transglutaminase, and maybe we can have another conversation in the future.
Excellent. Thank you.
And we'll have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dr. Osborne Zone. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe for more content like this, and make sure you come back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time and Thursday at noon 30 for more episodes.